All right, welcome to another edition of Metal Detecting Genealogy. Today is a very windy day, extremely bright and cold, but I did find some limestone rocks which aren't normally found on the surface of fields, and this tells me that these limestone rocks probably belong to a building. And if you look, you can see some tiny ancient marine fossils that were formed in this limestone rock. And so this is probably the property of George Heiss. He was a farmer that lived here in about 1912, and his barn was somewhere where I'm standing. It's always amazing what you can find in the ground, the strangest things. This appears to be some type of weed cutter that was probably used by the farmer, George Heiss, to trim some weeds around his buildings. And you see, out here in the wilderness during the springtime, it's extremely dry and extremely windy, and if you don't trim the weeds around your barn, it's probably going to catch fire. Up next, we have a utilitarian find. Not an exciting find, but it does fit the story. I mean, every farm field has a couple broken tools in it that have been there for sometimes 150 years. And if you look at this, you'll see that it's a ball-peen hammer. And so the reason why it's called a ball-peen hammer is because one side is a ball shape and the other side is a flat shape that people would use to do something called peening. And that's when you take a tool that's designed to cut and you hammer the end flat and you get it as thin as you can get it. Now once you get it to be thin, then you can take a file to it, and with just a couple strokes of the file you can make it razor sharp, but it's got to be thinned down with a ball peen hammer. And you can see here that this grass is just perfect for burning, and so any farmer that owned a building that didn't want to be burned up would trim the grass around the building so that when fires did come through, then there wouldn't be extra fuel. Now, living in the Midwest, it's always a pain filming because if it's not extremely cold and muddy, it's going to be dry and dusty, and so you really don't have any perfect conditions, but you have to use the time that you're given. And so I'm out here today using this time, seeing what I can find. It's really interesting what a metal detector can find. Sometimes I find things that are so unbelievably small, I have trouble seeing them. And if you look at this find right here, this is one that's similar to that. It's actually a rivet, probably from a saddle or some type of leather work. It may have even been from some type of overalls or blue jeans. But in any case, this is extremely small and it's brass. Now, I find these things all the time, but it leads me to believe that if there really was silver coins out here, if there really were coins, then I would have found them. Because the fact that I can find this tiny, small little piece of brass means that I'm doing something right. Now, one of the most common and desirable finds that metal detectorists are trying to find are old coins as well as buttons. And I think it would be really cool to find a button that actually came from the person that we are investigating. However, what I have here is, I think, slightly better. And it's actually known as a medallion. And so a medallion is something that was used to identify the brand name of a tool, and in this case, it's a saw, a hand saw that was used probably by George Heiss when he was working on his barn out here. And if you look closely, you'll see it says S B. S. Biggins and Sons. Now, I looked that up, and this company made hand tools in Sheffield, England. And the company had about 3 different name changes. And so by looking at this name, I was able to derive the fact that this medallion right here would not be any newer than about 1858. So you're looking at something that probably came off an antique saw in 1912. 1912, this saw would have been an antique. So I don't know very much about George Heiss other than he had a barn right here and he owned this property in 1912. But I can tell you that it was probably a small building, and this is how it is most of the time with metal detecting. Even though we have 100 acres of field, most of the finds are condensed into probably about a 50-yard area. And so if you can find that 50-yard area, then you have some decent finds, but the rest of the field is usually pretty empty. Here we have a horseshoe that may have come from George Heiss's livestock. I know that he did have livestock, and even though it was 1912 and they definitely had tractors and steam-powered equipment, most people still used horses. George Heiss was born in 1864 and he died in 1920. And so that puts him in the same position as us. He saw tremendous changes during his lifetime. He basically went from log cabins to light bulbs, from muzzle loaders to machine guns, from telegraphs to telephones, from bonnets to bathing suits, from carriages to cars, from trains to planes. All of that happened in his lifetime. So he was probably the type of guy that said, oh, you know, when I was a kid, I remember how it used to be like this, you know. And in my generation, we are the last generation that will remember the world without internet. He also was a part of a time where the demographics in the United States changed. He was born in a family of 9 kids, and he only had one in his life. His parents probably got married when they were 16 to 20 years old. He got married when he was in his 40s. And you can see on the federal census in 1910 that he still wasn't married. He was in his 40s, and he lived with another family. He was categorized as a boarder and a farmer. So some families have their own maid, some have their own cook. This family had their own farmer. He must have brought home eggs and milk and frying chickens and all of that. How convenient is that? And so I don't know why he didn't get married, but in the federal census of 1920, we can see that he has a wife named Agnes, and she had a son, and he had a 1-year-old daughter. I think her name was Mabel. So at 50 years old, he was married with a 1-year-old. And the crazy thing is that he died that year. So his timing was off. He got married way late. He had 1 kid, and then he died that year. So that's all I could find out about him. He must have lived a pretty simple life. Him having the last name Heiss, that's German, and he may have been one of those German Mennonites that were living here at the time. And maybe that's why I didn't find any coins, because those people were very, very frugal. So in any case, thanks you for joining me on that adventure. That was a lot of work for what we found, but I mean, every single story has some type of meaning in it. Every single story. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.